In a small restaurant, a black waitress named Nina Carter is looked down on and scolded by her manager in front of everyone after she drops a glass. She stays silent, enduring it all, just hoping to earn enough to pay for her mother's treatment. One night, she serves a father and his daughter, a stern man and a little girl in a wheelchair who hasn't spoken a word. When Nina kneels to help the girl eat, the child suddenly speaks for the first time since the accident. The father is stunned, unable to believe what he's just witnessed. No one knows that he is the owner of the company that owns the restaurant. The next day, he returns not for dinner, but to change Nina's life forever. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The sound of shattering glass sliced through the ambient hum of river and rye like a blade through silk. Conversations halted mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and heads turned instinctively toward the source of the noise. There, near the center aisle, stood Nina Carter, shoulders tense, eyes wide, lips pressed into a line that trembled only slightly. A water glass lay in jagged ruins at her feet, a thin stream of water crawling across the polished floor like it too was trying to flee the moment. She didn't speak. She didn't panic. She simply dropped to her knees and began gathering the pieces, her fingers moving with the weary precision of someone who's done this before more than once. Each shard stung her palm like a quiet reminder you don't get to slip, not even a little. From across the dining room, a voice cut through the silence, sharp, nasal, and entirely too loud. "Third time this month, Carter. Comes out of your paycheck." That voice belonged to Mr. Green, mid-50s, pink-faced, wears authority like a badge and a cheap cologne like war paint. He stood at the host stand with arms crossed, surveying the scene like a general overseeing a failed maneuver. He didn't bother lowering his voice. In fact, he raised it, making sure the surrounding customers could hear him loud and clear. Some diners looked up visibly uncomfortable. Others buried their faces deeper into menus, pretending not to notice the public humiliation playing out in front of their dinner rolls. Nina said nothing. She didn't defend herself. She didn't plead. Her silence wasn't agreement. It was survival. For someone like her, a black woman serving in a predominantly white upscale restaurant, survival sometimes looked like swallowing pride and picking up broken glass while a room full of strangers quietly judged everything but the man doing the judging. She rose carefully, dropping the shards into the bin behind the bar, her hands red but uncut. She didn't meet anyone's eyes, not even the sympathetic gaze of Rosie, the youngest hostess, who watched from the corner with a wince. Mr. Green's eyes followed her as she moved back toward her section. There was something in his stare, not just irritation, but dismissal. Like Nina wasn't just beneath him in rank, but beneath him in worth. The way he always said Carter, never Miss Carter, or simply Nina, made it clear she was not one of them, not in his eyes, and she never would be. By the time she reached her next table, the hum of conversation had resumed, the moment tucked away like so many others, forgotten by everyone but her. She took a deep breath and forced her shoulders back. She had no time for shame. Not tonight, not when her mother was at home, likely struggling to finish dinner, possibly shaking too hard to lift a spoon. Nina had set the food out before leaving, arranged the pills by the sink in a daily divider, but it wasn't the same. Her mom, Evelyn Carter, had always been the strong one, a nurse for 30 years until her body betrayed her in slow motion. Muscle weakness, poor coordination, speech that slurred on bad days. Doctors still weren't sure whether it was early onset ALS or something rarer, more insidious, more expensive to treat. All Nina knew was that it was progressing, and fast, and insurance didn't stretch far enough when it came to rare neurodegenerative diseases. She had no backup, no partner, no siblings. Just her and her mother in a 2-bedroom apartment with a leaky ceiling and a refrigerator full of borrowed time. The buzzing in her pocket was the familiar vibration of her phone. She stole a glance when she ducked into the employee station. A text from her mom's elder care app, *, evening meds due, not marked as taken. *, a pit formed in her stomach. She sent a quick voice note. "Hey Ma, just checking in. Remember to take your pills. I'll call on my break, okay?" She added a heart emoji. Not because she was the emoji type, but because Evelyn had said once that the little red heart made her feel like Nina was closer, safer. Green walked past the station and smirked. "We texting our boyfriends now. Carter, or just scrolling GoFundMe again?" She didn't flinch. That was the real win, wasn't it? Not showing the twitch when someone meant to cut you. She just turned to him, voice calm but even. "Just checking in on my mother." He scoffed. "Maybe if you focused more on the customers and less on your little soap opera, we wouldn't be sweeping up after you." He looked her over with that same half sneer he always wore when addressing her. It wasn't just the broken glass. It was her existence that annoyed him. Nina could feel it like static under her skin. She turned away before her temper boiled over. Back to work. Always back to work. By 7:00 p.m., the dinner rush had reached its peak. Plates clattered, orders flew in, and the kitchen barked like a war zone. Nina moved table to table with practiced grace, the kind that comes not from joy, but from need. There were newer servers on the floor, college students working weekends for beer money or spring break savings. But Nina worked full-time, double shifts, 6 days a week. She didn't have the luxury of saying no to any table, even the ones the others avoided. So when a new ticket came in for table 12 and Rosie murmured, "No one wants that one," Nina barely paused. "Why not?" she asked, already grabbing menus. "Just weird vibe," Rosie replied. "Dad in a suit, kid in a wheelchair. Didn't say a word when I greeted them. Like, stared through me." Nina took the menus anyway. "Then I guess it's my turn." She headed toward table 12, her steps, even her expression, calm, the same way she'd walk into a hospital room during her brief shining days in med school, because people don't stop being people, just because others get uncomfortable around them. As she approached, she saw them clearly. The man, white mid-40s, well-dressed but not flashy, sat straight-backed, hands folded in his lap, eyes scanning the room like he didn't trust it. Next to him, a young girl, maybe 10, sat in a sleek, modern wheelchair. Long blonde hair framed her pale face, but she wasn't looking up. Her shoulders were tight arms locked on the chair. There was a stiffness about her, not just physical, emotional, like she was braced for something. Nina smiled gently. "Good evening. I'm Nina. I'll be taking care of you tonight." The man looked up first. His eyes were pale and sharp, but not unkind. He nodded. "Thank you. I'm Daniel. This is my daughter Lily." Lily didn't respond, didn't even lift her head. "That's a lovely name," Nina said softly, directing her attention to Lily's bent frame, but not forcing it. She crouched a little to lower herself, not dramatically, just enough to be on the same plane. "Lily, I brought 2 menus, but I can read anything out loud if it's easier." Still nothing. Not even a blink. Nina glanced at the father, who offered a small, tight smile, the kind that said, "We're used to this." She continued unfazed. "I'll give you a few minutes to settle in. I'll bring water and a lemonade. Let me know if you prefer something else." She turned to go, and just before she reached the drink station, she heard the smallest sound. A breath. A whisper. Barely audible. It came from Lily. Nina didn't turn. She just smiled to herself. She'd heard it. And more importantly, she'd felt it. Nina didn't turn around when she heard the whisper. She didn't need to. She recognized the weight of silence, breaking the subtle shift in energy, the way a moment that once felt still suddenly seemed alive with possibility. She'd spent years studying that kind of change in textbooks, yes, but also in hospital corridors, in therapy sessions, with scared children, in the long, aching hours at home, helping her mother relearn how to button a blouse. Sometimes the smallest sound was everything. So she kept walking, let the moment breathe, and only glanced back when she reached the server station to pour water into 2 clean glasses. From the corner of her eye, she saw it, Lily's hand resting lightly on the edge of the menu, her fingers splayed like she wasn't sure whether she was reading it or holding it for comfort. Nina selected a strawberry lemonade, added a bendy straw, and placed both drinks on her tray with the kind of care one usually reserves for fine china. It wasn't just about service. It was about saying without words, "I see you. You matter. And I'm not afraid of your silence." As she made her way back to the table, the chaos of the restaurant faded around her. The noise, the clatter, the ticking clock inside her head that usually counted tips by the minute, it all quieted. For once, she was simply present. "Here we go," she said, gently placing the water in front of Daniel with a practiced elegance, and then turning to Lily. She positioned the lemonade just within reach, aligning the straw to Lily's left side. The child didn't look up, but her fingers twitched slightly. Nina didn't miss it. Daniel noticed too. "She's right-handed," he said quietly, almost in apology. "I know," Nina replied with a small smile, but her right shoulder's locked, forearms tight. She might be favoring her left for now. Just a guess. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Not accusatory, but curious. "You a nurse or something?" Nina shook her head. "Just familiar." That was all she said, but Daniel studied her a moment longer, as if weighing whether to ask more. He didn't. Turning to Lily, Nina lowered her voice just a touch, smoothing it like a well-worn page. My mom struggles with her right side too. Different reason maybe, but I've seen how frustrating it is when your brain says do it, and your body just won't. She paused, giving Lily time to process or ignore. Still last week, she picked up a grape with chopsticks. Took months, but she did it. We celebrated with too much ice cream. Something flickered across Lily's face. Not a smile. Not yet. But the smallest twitch near her lips, like her muscles remembered how to shape one. Nina didn't press. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, not in a hovering way, but to speak just to Lily. You don't have to talk to me if you're not ready, or ever. But just so you know, I picked that lemonade because it's the right kind of sweet. Not the kind that makes your teeth ache. The kind that feels like a good day, rare but worth waiting for. Lily's fingers curled lightly around the straw. Nina stood. I'll give you both a few minutes with the menu, she said to Daniel, who nodded once, still watching her with that analytical gaze. Not cold, but distant, like someone taking mental notes they'd never write down. Let me know if anything feels overwhelming. We can take it slow. As she stepped away, her mind drifted briefly back to the hospital corridors she used to walk in her white coat, back to study sessions filled with anatomical drawings and case studies, back to the way her professors had said she had a gift for bedside manner. She hadn't thought about that in a while, not since she traded her stethoscope for an apron. Behind the bar, Rosie gave her a sideways glance. You took 12, she whispered. That kid hasn't said a word to anyone all night. Nina poured 2 Diet Cokes for another table, her expression unreadable. Maybe she just hasn't had someone talk to her like a person instead of a diagnosis. Rosie blinked. Wait, you think she's... Doesn't matter what I think, Nina said softly. Matters what she needs. At that moment, she wasn't a server on a double shift. She was a woman who knew what it meant to feel helpless, who'd watched her own mother lose her independence inch by inch, who'd read every piece of literature she could find on neuromuscular disorders, not for a degree, but for survival. She brought out their food 15 minutes later, balancing plates with ease. We have the grilled salmon with roasted asparagus, she announced, with a little flair, setting Daniel's plate down carefully. And the most popular item among 10-year-old critics, mac and cheese with toasted breadcrumbs. Daniel blinked. She didn't order that. Nina crouched slightly to meet Lily's gaze. She didn't have to. She looked at the picture for 5 seconds longer than anything else on the menu. Daniel gave a small surprised laugh, not mocking, but genuine. That's impressive. Nina winked at Lily. I have a very advanced degree in menu telepathy. Lily's gaze lingered on her longer this time. No smile, no words, but she didn't look away. And when Nina stepped back, Lily picked up the fork in her left hand and made an effort. It was clumsy. Half the noodles slipped, but she tried. Daniel, clearly taken aback, leaned forward. Lily, would you like some help? The girl stiffened. Her jaw tightened. That question wasn't new to her, and the tension said she didn't want the answer to be yes. Before the frustration could mount, Nina stepped forward, not in pity, but in partnership. Mind if I show you a trick? She asked gently. Lily hesitated, then nodded very slightly. Nina pulled over an empty chair, sat beside her, and picked up the fork. She demonstrated slowly. If you shift your grip like this and rest your arm here, see that your hand won't have to do all the work. Your shoulder helps stabilize it. She handed the fork back. Lily tried again. Better this time. Still wobbly, but the bite made it to her mouth. Daniel looked like he might cry. You were in med school, he said softly. Nina didn't look up. Almost. 2 years. Pediatrics. Had to leave when my mom got sick. Lily took another bite. And then another. And then to Nina's quiet astonishment spoke. That's why you know about nerves. Daniel inhaled sharply. It was the first time he'd heard her speak in public since the accident. Nina nodded slowly. Yeah, I had to learn. The books helped, but real life taught me more. My mom's body forgot how to move, but her mind still brilliant. We just had to find new ways to talk to it. Lily looked at her own hand. Mine forgot too. No, Nina said gently. It remembers. It just has to take a different road now. The girl stared at her for a long moment. I used to draw, but now I can't. Nina smiled. Bet you can. Maybe not the same way, but there's more than one way to make something beautiful. A tiny nod, a crumb of hope, and for the first time, a faint glow of something more than pain in Lily's pale face. As Nina stood to leave, Daniel's voice stopped her. Thank you. She turned her expression warm. Just doing my job. But they both knew she wasn't. By the time Nina finally stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of the day clung to her like steam from a closed kitchen. Her legs ached from 10 hours on her feet, and her arms throbbed with the dull exhaustion of carrying more than she should have. Plates, trays, tension, silence. She walked the 6 blocks home with her head down, counting cracks in the sidewalk, each step a quiet echo in the dark. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly asleep, save for the occasional television flicker behind second-story curtains or the faint bark of a restless dog. When she reached her building, a weary 3-story walk-up with paint peeling like tired skin, she paused at the bottom step, stared up at the flickering hallway light, and took a long breath before climbing. Inside the apartment smelled faintly of medicated lotion and reheated soup. Her mother's bedroom door was ajar, and the low hum of the portable fan covered the light rasp of snoring. Evelyn Carter, once a sharp-witted nurse with a no-nonsense stare and an unshakable work ethic, now lay curled on her side, her hand still loosely gripping the remote that had fallen across her blanket. One leg twitched slightly in her sleep, as if chasing something she used to outrun. Nina didn't turn on the light. She stepped quietly into the room, adjusted the blanket over her mother's shoulder, then tiptoed to the kitchen, where a Post-it note marked the date Wednesday, 8 p.m. meds. The pill organizer sat beside a cup of untouched chamomile tea, and the Wednesday night compartment was still full. Nina didn't sigh. Sighing was for people who expected more. Instead, she poured a glass of water, shook her mother gently, and waited as Evelyn blinked awake. Her voice was slurred but familiar, tinted with apology and weariness. "Did I miss them again?" Nina smiled softly. "Just fashionably late. Let's fix it." She helped her sit up, supported her back with the worn pillow they used for moments like these, and waited while her mother swallowed. It took longer than it should have. Nina's hand remained steady throughout. Later, once her mother had drifted off again, Nina sat at the small kitchen table, her knees drawn up, her arms folded around them, like a child seeking warmth. The refrigerator hummed behind her. Bills were pinned to the freezer door with a chipped magnet from a health clinic. Most of them were past due. Some of them didn't even feel real anymore. Her laptop sat closed on the table, the corner scuffed the charger, barely holding. She opened it. Not to check emails or social media she hadn't scrolled in days, but to log into the old student portal at Kenmore Medical. Surprisingly, her credentials still worked. The university had allowed her limited access for future reapplication, though she wasn't sure what future they meant. She hadn't fully been a student for over 3 years, but the system still welcomed her like a ghost returning to a home that had long since been rented to someone else. The screen flickered, then settled on her profile. Carter Nina, Pediatric Neurology Track, GPA 3.87, Scholarship Recipient, Emerging Pediatric Scholars. The words looked like they belonged to someone else now, someone whole, someone untouched by insurance denials and manager insults, and Friday nights spent icing sore ankles. She clicked through old class notes, lecture recordings, and bookmarked case studies. The one she'd obsessed over early intervention in pediatric spastic hemiplegia. She remembered the article not for the content, though it was excellent, but because it was the last thing she read before her mother fell in the kitchen and couldn't get up. That night, Nina had rushed home without finishing her shift at the clinic. She never went back. The decision to leave wasn't sudden. It had been a slow, unraveling, missed classes, rescheduled exams, and anatomy lab she couldn't attend because her mother's tremors made her afraid to be left alone. The scholarship board had been sympathetic at first. Her advisor, Dr. Winters, had said, "We can pause. We can find solutions. Don't rush this decision." But Nina hadn't rushed. She had lived the choice every day for months until there was no more room left to pretend she could do both. She'd written a single line in her withdrawal form, "Family Medical Emergency. Hope to return." But hope had quickly been replaced by reality rent prescriptions, round-the-clock care, and the quiet terror of watching a parent fade in strength while staying painfully present in mind. Evelyn Carter never lost her intellect, just her body. That Nina realized was the cruelest trick of all. She clicked over to her inbox half out of habit. Most messages were spam or health newsletters she hadn't unsubscribed from. But near the top, bolded and unread, sat an email from Dr. Winters dated 7 days ago. Subject: Pediatric Neuro Research Opportunity. Time sensitive. Nina stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Nina, I hope this message finds you well. I know it's been some time, but your name came up recently during a faculty discussion about pediatric neurology. I mentioned your potential because even after your withdrawal, no one forgot it. A funded research position has opened in our department. It includes full tuition remission and a stipend. The selection committee has already closed applications, but I advocated for a late submission in your name. If you're interested, we'd need your materials by the 15th. No pressure, just a window, should you wish to step through it. Warmly, Dr. Elaine Winters. The 15th was tomorrow. Nina's chest tightened, not from fear, from something worse, that quiet, dangerous thing called hope, the kind that tapped you on the shoulder after 3 years of silence, smiled sweetly, and said, "Remember me?" She began to type a reply, fingers hesitant. "Dear Dr. Winters, I'm honored by your message. Then she stopped. She thought about her mom, about the schedule pills at 8 a.m., 2 p.m., 8 p.m., the physical therapy sessions twice a week, the falls, the small victories, the fact that Evelyn's insurance barely covered generic medication, let alone the cost of someone to help, while Nina was at class or lab. Even if Dr. Winters reopened the door, what then? Who would care for her mother? Who would pay rent? Drive to appointments, fight with billing departments that kept misplacing codes? She closed the email draft without deleting it. Then slowly she opened another tab and typed spastic hemiplegia in children into the search bar. She scrolled through medical diagrams, therapy approaches, caregiver tips. Her eyes landed on a case study written last year about an 8-year-old girl who'd lost use of her right side following trauma. The descriptions matched Lily, almost exactly. Nina leaned back, eyes stinging. She hadn't just helped a child with mobility issues tonight. She had recognized the way Lily's shoulder slumped, the specific tension in her elbow, the way her fingers curled inward, the short, shallow breaths that came from emotional masking. These weren't observations a casual server could make. They were the instincts of someone who'd trained for this, lived alongside it, and carried the weight of it in both her academic and personal life. When Lily had spoken, it hadn't been an accident. It wasn't coincidence. It was connection. The kind textbooks couldn't teach. The kind that said, "I see you. I know what you're fighting. And I'm not afraid." Outside the window, the city glowed with soft orange halos around street lamps. Far in the distance, the lights of Kenmore Medical Center blinked faintly through the fog. It used to feel like home. Nina closed the laptop, sat there in the dark for a long time, not thinking, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the rhythmic breath of her mother sleeping down the hall, and somewhere deep inside her, the sound of a door she thought was locked, beginning just maybe to open again. The morning after the email sat unanswered, Nina arrived at River and Rye 15 minutes early. The restaurant wasn't open yet, but the lights were on, and the faint clatter of prep work hummed in the background. The air smelled like bleach and flour and cheap syrup, familiar grounding. She moved past the hostess stand, nodded at Enrique, the line cook, and made her way to the back, where the new weekly schedule had just been taped to the wall outside the break room. She glanced at it out of habit, expecting to see the usual 5 dinners, 2 lunches, reliable, predictable, barely enough but consistent. What she saw instead made her heart knock twice against her ribs. 3 shifts, just 3, and none of them the high-tip weekend dinners she relied on to cover her mother's meds. She scanned again, thinking maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was a second page, but it was real. Clear as daylight. 3 shifts, and one of them a Tuesday lunch where the restaurant barely pulled in enough customers to break even. Behind her, she heard the oily voice before she saw him. Problem with the schedule. Carter. Mr. Green emerged from his office with a coffee cup and a condescending smirk. He didn't look up from his phone, didn't stop walking. Nina turned to face him. "I've been working the weekend shifts for over a year," she said, her voice calm but edged with disbelief. "This cuts my hours in half." Green shrugged. "We're overstaffed. Had to make some changes." "You gave Kayla 4 extra shifts," Nina countered, keeping her tone even. "She just got here 6 months ago and missed 2 last week." He finally looked up, smug and unbothered. "Kayla's trying to make rent." Nina blinked. "She lives with her parents. She said she's saving for a trip to Coachella." Green's eyes narrowed. The smile fell away, replaced by something flatter, colder. "This isn't personal," he said, but his voice made it clear that it was. "And this isn't a charity. I don't schedule based on sympathy. I schedule based on efficiency and attitude. Maybe check yours." Nina stared at him, stunned by the audacity, but she didn't push. She knew better. With men like Green, pushing only gave them another reason to swing. Behind them, Kayla breezed in, sipping an iced coffee the size of her head and barely glancing at the schedule before chirping, "Oh my God, I got Friday night. That's like my lucky section." She caught sight of Nina and gave a half smile. "Don't worry, girl, maybe next week." Nina said nothing. She walked past them, both eyes on the floor, heart pounding. Her hands were already doing the math, 3 shifts at minimum wage plus tips less reliable now than ever. Rent, insurance, prescriptions, gas, food. The numbers didn't add up, and they hadn't in months. She'd just been patching holes with grit and prayer, and now the patches were splitting. Her section that night was by the back corner near the bathrooms, and the kitchen door, a dead zone for tipping. Low traffic, high complaints, and always the last to get cleared. She knew what it meant. She wasn't being cut entirely. That would be too obvious. Instead, she was being squeezed, slowly, strategically, until she gave up on her own. By 7:30, the restaurant was buzzing. Kayla and the other younger servers floated through the prime tables at the front, laughing too loud, and charming middle-aged couples with tired smiles and polished flirtation. Nina kept her head down, moving quickly between tables that didn't look up when they handed her their cards, didn't say thank you, didn't leave more than a few dollars on a $50 tab. At 8 o'clock, Daniel Everett returned. He came alone this time, no Lily beside him. Just a man in a suit seated at a quiet booth near the bar, hands folded, eyes calm. He didn't request, Nina didn't make a scene. He simply watched, quietly, intentionally. Nina saw him the way you see a fire escape in a burning building, noticeable, but too far to matter yet. She nodded when their eyes met briefly and continued her rounds. What she didn't know was that he had chosen that table for a reason. From there, he could see the whole restaurant, the flow, the hierarchy, the inequity. He watched Green hover around Kayla's tables like a peacock, laughing too loudly at her jokes, adjusting the thermostat when she pouted about being cold. He watched Nina carry double trays into the back without anyone offering help. He watched her apologize for things that weren't her fault, watched her fold napkins while her section sat empty, ignored. And then he watched Green walk up to her and gesture toward the back office with a tilt of his head that said, "Asterisk, now." Asterisk. Nina followed. Of course she did. She always did. Inside the cramped office, the air smelled like stale coffee and bitter power. Green sat behind the desk and didn't invite her to sit. "Customers complained about wait times in your section tonight," he said, not looking up. "I had 4 tables and a 15-minute backlog from the kitchen," Nina replied. "I kept drinks full and didn't miss a single order." He looked up now. Still not good enough. She exhaled slowly. Is this really about performance? His smile returned poisonous. "You want to play Nurse Carter, maybe you should go back to med school. But as long as you're here, act like staff, not Florence Nightingale." Nina's eyes didn't blink. "I didn't realize helping a disabled child eat dinner counted as insubordination." "It counts as wasting time," he said. "And this is a business. We don't have time to waste." Her fists clenched at her sides. "She's 10 years old. She's not your kid," Green snapped. "And this isn't a therapy center. You want to be a saint. Do it on your own time. While you're here, I need fast. I need efficient. I need invisible." For a moment, the room pulsed with silence, and then Nina said, clear and low, "Maybe I will go back to med school." Green chuckled. "Well, until then, you work for me. Tuesday lunch shift. Don't be late." He tossed a tip envelope across the desk. It landed lightly like a joke. Nina picked it up, felt the weight, or the lack of it. $43. 10 hours of service and barely enough to fill a tank of gas. She walked out of the office without a word, past the laughter at table 6, past the smell of truffle fries and cheap wine, past Daniel Everett, who watched her without moving. Their eyes met again. By the time Nina returned to the floor that evening, her body was already in protest. Her lower back screamed from the weight of the double shift, and the ache in her feet pulsed with the kind of fatigue that no cushion-soled shoe could fix. The corner section where she'd been reassigned, the one nearest the bathroom and the swinging kitchen door, was dimly lit, drafty, and frequently forgotten by both staff and patrons. It was a place where tips went to die, where tables sat too long without drink refills, and where customers left more annoyed than full. But Nina didn't complain. She never did. Not because she was a pushover, but because she knew the cost of resistance when you were already standing at the bottom of the ladder. She moved through the dinner crowd like a current under the surface, calm, controlled, but always carrying weight. It wasn't until she reached the edge of her section that she noticed them again. Seated quietly at table 17, near the restroom hallway and far removed from the ambiance of the central dining area, were Daniel and Lily Everett. They hadn't asked to be seated there. No one ever did, but that's where they had been placed, almost certainly by Green's passive design. A wealthy man and his disabled daughter tucked neatly into the restaurant's blind spot. Daniel didn't seem bothered. In fact, he looked as if he'd chosen it himself, settling in with a kind of stillness that unnerved the noise around him. He sat back in his chair, eyes steady, one arm resting on the table. Lily sat beside him, shoulders curved inward, her hands in her lap. Her long hair fell like a curtain over one cheek, hiding half of her expression, but Nina didn't need to see her face to feel the tension rolling off her small frame. Nina paused before approaching. Something about their return felt deliberate, though she didn't know why. Last time, Lily had barely spoken, but tonight, there was something different. Not louder, not clearer, just different. As she walked up to the table, she smiled gently, her voice a soothing thread in the chaos of clinking glasses and sizzling pans. "Welcome back," she said, addressing them both equally, as if no time had passed and no memories had lingered too long. "I'm glad to see you." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "We enjoyed our meal last time. Thought we'd try our luck again." Before Nina could respond, a quiet voice drifted from beneath the blonde curtain. "Mac and cheese." Nina turned to Lily, whose gaze remained fixed somewhere on the table. The girl's fingers twitched slightly, tapping a rhythm only she could hear. Nina didn't miss a beat. "Excellent choice. Our chef made a fresh batch this afternoon. 3 cheeses, buttery crumbs on top. I'll make sure it comes out just right." Lily didn't respond, but her hand stopped tapping. Daniel ordered grilled salmon again, his tone soft, but Nina sensed he was watching her with more focus now. Not scrutiny, something closer to curiosity, like a man trying to understand a language he hadn't heard spoken in years. 15 minutes later, the mac and cheese arrived, golden, steaming, perfectly portioned. Nina placed the plate in front of Lily, careful to align the fork to her left side without making a show of it. Daniel received his meal with a polite nod, but his attention quickly returned to his daughter. At first, Lily made no move. She stared at the food like it was a test she hadn't studied for. Then slowly, she reached for the fork with her left hand. Her fingers curled awkwardly around the handle. The muscles in her forearm tensed. She tried to lift a bite, but the fork shook in midair, spilling its contents before reaching her mouth. The second attempt was no better. On the third, the fork slipped, completely clattering against the plate with a sharp clink that cut through the hum of nearby conversations. Lily's face flushed deep red, her lips pressed together, the hand that had reached so carefully now clenched into a trembling fist. Daniel leaned in, reaching out instinctively. "Let me help no." The word burst from Lily like a spark from a frayed wire. Daniel froze. His hand stopped midair, uncertain. His expression tightened, not in frustration, but in pain, that helpless, hollow kind that only parents know when their child suffers and there's no comforting fix. That's when Nina moved. She stepped forward, quietly pulled up an unused chair from the next table and sat down beside Lily. She didn't ask permission. She didn't clear her throat or announce herself. She simply entered the moment like someone who belonged there. "Hey, Lily," she said, her voice level, unhurried. "Mind if I join you for a second?" Lily didn't answer, but she didn't resist either. Her hands were balled in her lap, shoulders rigid. Nina picked up the fork, gently held it in her own left hand. "Can I show you something?" she asked. Again, no response. Nina continued anyway. "See, sometimes when our nerves get scrambled up, our hand forgets how to listen to our brain. But the brain, it doesn't stop trying. It just looks for a new path, like when a street's blocked and the GPS reroutes you. Still the same destination, just a different road." She demonstrated slowly, guiding the fork into the dish, using her own shoulder and wrist as leverage. "Try tucking your elbow close to your side and resting your arm on the table like this. It helps with control, less shaking." She handed the fork back. Lily hesitated, then mirrored the position. Her grip was uncertain, but more stable. She scooped a modest bite of macaroni, raised it slowly, steadily into her mouth. It landed. Her jaw worked carefully as she chewed. When she swallowed, she looked at Nina, not fully, not square in the eye, but enough. A single smile flickered across her lips, small, hesitant, beautiful. It lasted only a moment, but for Nina, it was enough. For Daniel, it was shattering. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He sat, frozen eyes on his daughter's lips, parted slightly, as if caught mid-prayer. Something behind his gaze crumpled, not from sadness but from sheer awe. He had brought Lily to therapy, to specialists, to in-home tutors, and none of them had done what this tired server, this former student in worn-out shoes, had done in less than 10 minutes, given his daughter back her own power. Lily took another bite, this one on her own. No help, no spill. "I had an accident," she said suddenly quietly. Nina didn't flinch. "I know. My mom was there too. She didn't make it." Nina's heart pulled hard in her chest. She nodded gently. "I'm really sorry, Lily. That's a big thing. Too big for someone your age. Or any age." The girl looked at her fork, then at her hand. "I used to draw. With my right. I can't anymore." "Well," Nina said, smiling softly, "drawing with your left makes you twice as impressive. Most people can't draw with either hand." That earned a breath of a laugh. Not full-throated, but real. Nina rose slowly. "I should check on my other tables. You two enjoy the mac and cheese." As she turned to leave, Lily's voice stopped her again. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Nina paused, then looked over her shoulder. "If I'm lucky." She disappeared into the crowd, but Daniel's eyes followed her long after she was gone. He didn't know her story yet, not all of it, but he had seen what mattered. He had watched his daughter come back to life just a little because one woman saw her not as broken, not as delicate, but as worthy. And for the first time in 18 months, he didn't feel hopeless. He felt something dangerous. He felt hope. By the time the morning sun edged over the skyline, casting long golden streaks across the chipped pavement outside Nina's apartment building, she was already awake. She hadn't really slept. Not after the night she had. The image of Lily's small, trembling hand gripping the fork of the bite of mac and cheese, making it all the way to her mouth, of that fleeting, beautiful smile, it haunted her, but in the best possible way. It had felt like a victory, a quiet, deeply personal one. But in her world, victories didn't pay rent. Kindness didn't get you more shifts. And so when her phone buzzed before 7 a.m., a text from Green flashing bluntly on the screen, "Come in, 800 sharp. We need to talk." The unease returned like a tide. She dressed carefully, not because she expected anything good, but because she wanted to walk into that building with her head high, no matter what was coming. The restaurant was still half dark when she arrived. Chairs were upside down on tables, the scent of lemon sanitizer still fresh in the air. Green was already in the back office, the door open just wide enough to suggest he wasn't in the mood for questions. Nina stepped inside, shoulders straight, voice neutral. "You wanted to see me." Green didn't look up right away. When he did, his smile was thin, performative, the kind of smirk that never reached his eyes. "Have a seat," he said, though the tone implied she might as well not bother. She stood. "Last night," he began, flipping through a clipboard without really reading it, "you spent nearly 40 minutes at one table. That's not what we pay you for, Carter." Nina felt the words tighten in her throat, but she kept her voice even. "She's 10 years old. She's recovering from a neurological trauma. She fed herself for the first time in over a year. And what does that have to do with running food?" He snapped, finally looking up. "This is a restaurant, not a rehab clinic. If you want to volunteer at some children's ward, be my guest. But while you're here, you follow policy. We serve. We don't fix." Her jaw tensed. "Are you firing me?" "Not yet," he said almost gleefully. "But I am cutting your shifts. 2 a week. 1 lunch, 1 dinner. You're not worth the labor hours." The words hit harder than she expected, even though she'd braced herself for the worst. 2 shifts wouldn't even cover her mother's prescriptions, let alone groceries or rent. Still, she didn't let him see her flinch. He slid an envelope across the desk. It landed like a slap. She picked it up. Lighter than it should have been. When she opened it, she found only $43 in tips. "Adjusted," he said before she could ask. "Kayla covered more tables while you were otherwise occupied." Nina stood for a long moment, envelope in hand, anger rising like heat, but held tightly under control. She turned and left without another word. She was almost to the break room when a voice stopped her. "Miss Carter, would you come back in, please?" The voice wasn't Green's. It was deeper, calmer, familiar. She turned slowly and saw him, Daniel Everett, seated now in Green's office across from the desk. His presence filled the room, not with noise, but with weight. He was no longer the reserved, quiet father from the dining room. His posture was different. Authority radiated from him like electricity. Green was standing now, 2 stiff eyes darting from Daniel to Nina, like a man slowly realizing he was no longer in control. "Mr. Everett, with all due respect, this is an internal matter. "You can sit," Daniel said coolly, not looking at him. "You've said enough." Nina stepped back into the office, confused, guarded. Daniel gestured to the chair opposite him. This time she sat. "Miss Carter," he began, tone formal but not cold. "You've had an eventful few weeks, haven't you?" She didn't answer, not because she didn't have words, but because she had too many. He continued, "What you don't know is that River and Rye is one of several restaurants under the Bennett Hospitality Group. I own it. Have for about 6 months now. Until recently, I hadn't paid this location much attention, but reports came across my desk. Numbers not lining up, employee turnover, customer satisfaction dipping despite solid traffic. So I decided to see for myself." He turned his eyes to Green, whose face was draining color by the second. "Imagine my surprise," Daniel said, voice sharp as glass, "when I found a manager who plays favorites, manipulates schedules, and penalizes staff who show compassion." Green tried to recover. "I wasn't aware you were coming. If you'd informed me, I could have—" "You would have staged it," Daniel interrupted, "cleaned it up, hidden the rot. But what I saw was honest, raw, and deeply disappointing." He opened a folder on the desk, pulling out documents. Payroll summaries, schedule logs, tip share discrepancies, even a printed transcript from security footage. "I had my team audit your books last night. The discrepancies aren't just poor management, they're unethical, possibly illegal." Green's face twisted. He stood defiant. "You set me up, you and that little crippled brat." The room fell into an unnatural stillness. Daniel rose slowly. His voice, when it came, was low but deadly. "That child is my daughter, and you just insulted her." Two security staff stepped into the doorway as if summoned by instinct. Daniel didn't even look at them. "Mr. Green, you are hereby terminated from all positions within Bennett Hospitality, effective immediately. You will surrender your keys, company access, and any remaining documentation before leaving this building. Now." Green opened his mouth, then closed it again. The fight drained out of him like air from a balloon. He nodded once, tight and bitter, and walked out, flanked by security. The silence that followed was thick. Nina sat motionless, unsure if she should be stunned, relieved, or terrified. Daniel turned to her again. His expression softened. "I didn't come here just to fire someone," he said. "I came to thank someone." He slid a smaller envelope across the desk. She opened it. Inside was a clean copy of her old resume, the one from medical school, and a business card with his direct line. "I know who you are, Miss Carter, not just from last night. I made some calls, looked into your academic records, your work with children, your withdrawal letter. I understand what you gave up." She swallowed. Words still felt unsafe in her mouth. "I saw what you did for my daughter," he said, "and I saw what your manager did in response. That imbalance says everything." He leaned forward. "I'd like to discuss a new role, not as a server, but as someone who belongs in a place that values your mind and your heart. My office, tomorrow morning, if you're willing." She stared at him, at the card, at the open space where Green used to sit, and for the first time in a long, long time she felt the air shift. It wasn't rescue, it was recognition. The elevator ride to the top of the Bennett Enterprises Tower was nearly silent, save for the soft hum beneath Nina's feet and the rapid beat of her heart. It wasn't the height that unnerved her, but the weight of the moment. She had worn her best blouse ironed the night before and tucked her hair into a low bun, like she used to for her medical school labs. Still, she felt out of place. Like a ghost of a life interrupted, the receptionist had greeted her by name. Not Miss Carter, not the server from River and Rye, but Nina. Like she belonged here, like her presence was expected. That detail alone had made her eyes sting more than she wanted to admit. When the doors opened, she found herself not in an office, but in a lounge space that looked more like a living room than a corporate reception area. There, at a low glass table surrounded by sunlight and a halo of colored pencils, sat Lily. The girl was focused, tongue slightly peeking from the corner of her mouth, lost in the art she clutched in both hands. She looked up when Nina entered and smiled. "I drew you something," Lily said, without preamble, holding the page out with a small, proud gesture. Nina took it slowly, heart already tight. It showed 4 figures, Lily in her wheelchair, Daniel standing beside her, a woman with wings floating in the sky, and Nina in a white coat stethoscope and a bright smile drawn in red crayon. They stood in front of a big building labeled Emma Bennett Center. "That's you," Lily pointed. "I gave you a doctor coat because you help people get better like real doctors do." I think Mommy would have liked you." Nina didn't trust herself to speak. She just squeezed the girl's shoulder gently before Daniel appeared, his tone warm but composed. "We're ready whenever you are." She followed him into a spacious conference room with wide windows, polished wood, and a view that seemed to stretch across the whole city. A folder waited on the table, thick with printed pages and handwritten notes. But Daniel didn't start with paperwork. He poured her a cup of tea first. "You're not here for a pitch," he said. "You're here because you deserve to choose. No strings, no illusions, just options." He opened the folder and spread out 3 separate documents, each neatly labeled. Option 1, he began sliding the first toward her general manager at River and Rye. Full authority, triple the salary you were earning, full benefits, support for your mother's care. If you want stability, it's yours. Nina nodded slowly. She didn't need to read the fine print. It was generous enough to change her life, but something in her didn't stir. Not yet. Daniel moved to the second. Option 2, Bennett Foundation Health Initiative, Community Health Work. Pediatric outreach. You'd be trained and supported. You'd work with children in underserved areas. It's not clinical, but it's impactful. And you'd be making a difference. Still, Nina said nothing. Her eyes drifted toward the third document, the one with a medical school logo embossed in silver. Daniel followed her gaze. Option 3 is more complex, he said. We've partnered with Monroe Medical to reopen your file. They're offering you re-entry into their program with full scholarship coverage, tuition fees, housing, everything. Nina blinked, stunned. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. In addition, he continued, you would be formally contracted to serve as Lily's private therapy liaison. 3 days a week, home-based engagement. We want you in her life, not as charity, but because you're the one who helped her speak again. Smile again. Eat on her own. Your work has changed her. He leaned forward, voice steady. This would come with a substantial salary, enough to support your mother comfortably. We've also secured a caregiver plan for Evelyn, around-the-clock coverage, transportation, medical support. Everything. Nina stared at him, then looked at the paper again. It didn't feel real. It felt like fiction, like the kind of story people tell in movies, but not in life. Why, she asked finally, her voice almost a whisper. Why me? Why not just hire a specialist? Daniel's expression didn't waver. Because my daughter doesn't talk to specialists. She talks to you. You see her, not as a case, as a person. And because you've done more without a degree than some with a wall full of them. You didn't ask for this. You earned it. Quietly. Daily. Without anyone watching. And now, someone is. Nina lowered her eyes. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of a wall clock. Then she took a breath. Is this about Lily, or is this about you needing a doctor you trust? Daniel didn't flinch. This is about both. I need someone Lily chooses. She already has. The rest is up to you. He stood, then smoothing the front of his blazer. Take your time. The offer stands. Whatever you decide, we'll respect it. He left the room without waiting for thanks. Nina sat alone, the city skyline stretched before her, Lily's drawing still in her lap. A white coat, a building with her name inside it, a family that once didn't include her, now imagined with her in it, not because she demanded it, but because she made herself part of it, through compassion, presence, and something deeper than obligation. And for the first time in years, the question before her was not how to survive, but how to live. The apartment was quiet when Nina stepped inside, the kind of quiet that held its breath. Her shoes moved soundlessly across the worn linoleum, the weight of the folder still pressed against her side like a second spine. She set her bag down gently on the kitchen table and eased into the chair beside it, slowly unzipping the pouch to retrieve what felt less like documents and more like questions about who she could become. She didn't open them yet. Instead, she unfolded the piece of paper tucked between the pages, Lily's drawing now slightly creased, but still glowing with the sincerity only children possess. 4 figures stood in front of a sunlit building, labeled Emma Bennett Center. Lily sat in her wheelchair smiling. Daniel stood behind her. A woman with soft wings hovered above, surrounded by stars. And then there was Nina, drawn tall, in a white coat with her hand in Lily's. The smile on her cartoon face matched something Nina hadn't seen in a long time in any mere belief. She didn't sleep that night. She stayed at the table long after the light had dimmed, the only glow coming from the refrigerator and the pulse of the city filtering through the window. Thoughts swirled, not of money or title, but of responsibility, of possibility, of fear. What if she returned and failed? What if she wasn't enough? What if the world she left had moved on without her? She placed the drawing gently on the table and pressed her palms flat beside it. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the magnitude of what she had been offered, not a handout, but a door. By morning, the light was soft, almost apologetic. Her mother was already up sitting by the window with her hands curled around a mug of chamomile tea. Her robe hung loosely, a knit shawl draped across her shoulders. Evelyn Carter looked fragile in the light, yet anchored in a way only women who had survived years of silent battles could be. She looked up as Nina approached, her eyes sharp beneath the fog of fatigue. "You walked different last night," Evelyn said quietly. No accusation, just observation. Like the world had shifted a little. Nina pulled out the opposite chair and sat. She didn't respond right away. She let the question hang between them, suspended in the steam from their mugs. "They offered me something," she said finally. "Actually, 3 things. One of them, I never thought I'd get back." Evelyn didn't speak. She waited. She always had the kind of stillness that made others fill silence with honesty. "They want me to go back to medical school," Nina continued. "Monroe, full scholarship, housing, books, everything. They even made a plan so you'd be taken care of. Not just financially, home, healthcare, transportation, a real system." Her voice caught. She blinked twice quickly. "And in return, I work with Lily, 3 times a week. Structured sessions, it's official, but personal. She asked for me." Evelyn's hands tightened slightly on her mug. For a long moment, she didn't look up. "I used to lie awake at night," she said finally. "Back when the bills first came and your tuition notices kept arriving. I wanted to be strong enough to tell you to stay in school, to fight through it, to believe it would all sort itself out. But I couldn't. I couldn't watch you break trying to fix me." Nina opened her mouth to protest, but Evelyn raised a hand. "You never said a word about blaming me, but I know you paused your life for mine. And now," she took a long breath, "now you have a door. And if you don't walk through it, baby, I will carry that guilt forever." Nina reached across the table and took her mother's hand, her grip steady. "You didn't take anything from me. You taught me how to be someone worth offering the door to." Evelyn looked at her daughter like seeing the same child who used to bandage dolls and sit beside her bed, whispering anatomy terms from textbooks. "Then don't wait for permission. Take it. Go back. But go for you. Not to prove anything. Not to fix the past. Just because it's who you are." Nina stood a little while later, the drawing in one hand and her phone in the other. She stepped out onto the fire escape, the morning sun just rising above the east buildings, painting the bricks with gold. She flipped over the drawing and wrote with deliberate strokes, "Maybe I wasn't lost. Maybe I was waiting for the right reason to return." She looked at her phone. Daniel's name hovered in the message screen. She didn't rehearse. She didn't overthink. She just typed, "I'm ready. Tell Lily I'll bring snacks to our first session." The response came in under a minute. "She says she likes grapes and cheddar. We'll see you Sunday." Nina smiled, not the nervous smile of someone stepping into the unknown, but the soft, grounded kind of smile that comes from remembering who you were before the world got too loud, and knowing finally you get to become her again. The morning Nina returned to Monroe Medical, the sky was the kind of pale blue that made everything below it feel calmer than it was. She stood before the mirror in her modest apartment, buttoning the crisp white coat she had folded away 3 years earlier, her fingers lingering on the embroidered name tag stitched above her heart. N. Carter. The fabric felt familiar, yet foreign, like trying on a version of herself she hadn't worn in too long. Behind her, Evelyn sat near the window, wrapped in a knitted shawl, her eyes soft but awake, with a clarity that had become more frequent since the care schedule had stabilized. She didn't say much, but her voice carried what mattered. "Same coat," she murmured. "New story." Nina smiled at the reflection of her mother, then back at herself. She hadn't stepped into a classroom in years, hadn't held a medical journal or debated a diagnosis with peers, but somehow the act of standing there dressed and present already felt like a kind of reclamation. She kissed her mother on the forehead, grabbed her bag, and walked out the door with less hesitation than she expected. Campus was both unchanged and unrecognizable. The buildings stood where they always had, but the faces were newer, younger, and Nina was now the woman returning, not the student just arriving. As she entered the lecture hall, a few heads turned. Some looked curious, others indifferent, but no one whispered. She found a seat near the front, unpacked her tablet, and laid out a neatly folded notebook beside it. She didn't want to blend in. She wanted to earn her place all over again. Dr. Winters entered moments later, her presence as commanding and understated as Nina remembered. Her gaze scanned the room, landed on Nina briefly, and with the smallest of nods continued. Today, she said, we begin not with a diagnosis, but with a story, because the brain is not only chemistry, it is memory response adaptation. And if you forget that you're not practicing medicine, you're managing symptoms. Nina wrote each word, not just because it would be on the exam, but because she knew it to be true. She had seen it in Lily's eyes. She had seen what happened when someone spoke to the person behind the condition. That was where healing started. Later that week, Nina knocked gently on the door of the Bennett townhouse. A staff member opened it, welcomed her in, and guided her to the living room, where Lily waited at a low table marker splayed everywhere and a smile already forming. You came, the girl beamed. Nina smiled back. Of course I did. I brought snacks too. They settled in for their first session, which wasn't structured like a clinic, but flowed like a conversation. Lily responded better that way. They began with simple grip exercises disguised as art, then posture training while building a tower of cards. Daniel passed through the room once or twice, but said nothing, only watching from a distance, eyes soft with something that looked like hope. The dual life became Nina's new rhythm. Mornings were lectures, labs, and study sessions. Afternoons were therapy with Lily. Evenings often ended at home, where Evelyn asked gentle questions about the coursework, and sometimes shared memories of her own hospital stays with wry humor. Nina took notes on everything, not just the curriculum, but how Lily tilted her head when trying to form a difficult word, how her hand tensed when tired, how joy flickered on her face when a task she couldn't do yesterday suddenly became possible. It wasn't easy. There were moments she doubted herself when the weight of both worlds pressed on her shoulders like twin anchors. But every time Lily laughed, or a professor praised her insight, or her mother looked at her without apology in her eyes, Nina found footing again. One evening, after Lily managed to open a juice box without help for the first time, she turned to Nina and said, "I think I'm getting good because you don't look at me like I'm broken." Nina sat still for a moment, then said, "You're not broken. You're rebuilding. There's a difference." By the end of the semester, Nina was asked to join a pilot program in pediatric neurorehabilitation, a new branch linked to the center Daniel was funding. She sat in the first design meeting alongside seasoned professionals and offered suggestions drawn not from theory, but from her time with Lily. And when Dr. Winters introduced her to the group, she didn't say, "This is Nina Carter, re-enrolled medical student." She said, "This is Nina Carter, the reason we're building this program with new eyes." Nina stands before a small group of students and therapists in training, not as a peer, but as a guide. A slide flickers behind her showing an abstract diagram of pediatric neuroplasticity, but she steps in front of it and speaks from her notes with her own cadence. Recovery isn't linear, she says, and it doesn't always start in a hospital. Sometimes it starts with a glass of lemonade, with a laugh, with someone asking the right question. My patient's name is Lily. She taught me that healing begins where someone decides to stay, even when it's hard. There's no applause, just nods, silent understanding. And Lily, sitting in the back leg, swinging freely now, drawing in a fresh notebook labeled Dr. Nina's class. Nina glances at her, then looks out at the room. "If you forget everything else," she says gently, "remember this, we don't treat the illness, we meet the person. And if we're lucky, they let us walk with them a while." 1 year had passed since Nina Carter walked back through the doors of Monroe Medical and into the life she thought she had left behind. A lot can change in a year. The crisp white coat she wore no longer felt like borrowed armor. It molded to her like a second skin marked not only by the name stitched across the chest, but by the weight of hours, lessons, laughter, and setbacks stitched into every crease. The Emma Bennett Center for Pediatric Neuro Recovery now stood 3 blocks from the hospital, a facility unlike any other in the state. Bright murals lined the walls, many drawn from sketches by Lily herself showing children with wheelchairs turning into rockets, walkers into wings. The building was filled with light, real and symbolic, and it hummed with energy that didn't feel clinical. It felt alive. That morning, Nina stood just outside the main therapy wing, watching through a glass panel as a small group of new interns took notes. She recognized the nervous way one of them clutched their pen eyes wide and wary, like someone trying to pretend they belonged. She had stood exactly like that once. Maybe still did sometimes, though it showed less now. Behind her, Lily wheeled up dressed in a soft yellow volunteer shirt with the center's logo embroidered above her heart. Her steps had improved, not perfect, but steady. The wheelchair was still a part of her life, but it no longer defined the whole of it. She grinned when she saw Nina. "I told them the gummy bear game works better than the beanbag one," Lily announced, gesturing toward the therapy group. "They didn't believe me. Rookie mistake." Nina laughed, placing a hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "Let them learn the hard way. That's how we grow, right?" Lily nodded, then looked at her seriously. "You were right. About everything." Nina didn't reply, just gave the girl a look that held both affection and respect. Behind every confident word Lily spoke now lived months of quiet perseverance of choosing courage over comfort. And Nina knew better than anyone that every step forward had been earned. In the evenings, when the center grew quiet and the halls emptied, Nina sometimes returned to the small office they had given her. The walls were still bare, except for a single drawing, the one Lily had given her long ago, now framed and mounted. It still showed the same four figures, Lily, Daniel, Nina, in a white coat, and Catherine above them with her angel wings. Beneath the image, in slightly neater handwriting than before, Lily had added, "Thank you for not giving up on me." So I didn't give up on me either. That frame reminded Nina of what mattered on days when insurance calls, data reporting, and bureaucratic meetings threatened to drown the mission. She wasn't just a clinician anymore. She was now part of designing the center's long-term pediatric neuro program, hiring new therapists, and consulting on specialized curriculum with Monroe's residency faculty. And yet she still showed up for every one of Lily's sessions, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The connection between them had gone far beyond recovery. They were now each other's proof that healing wasn't a solo act. Back home, Evelyn had grown stronger. The new care structure allowed her to resume some of the things she'd once loved, tending a few potted herbs on the windowsill, reading aloud from the newspaper, leaving Nina gentle voice messages with her thoughts on books she was revisiting. That evening, over a quiet dinner of rosemary chicken and rice, she glanced at her daughter and asked, "Are you tired, honey?" Nina took a long sip of water, then smiled. "Yeah, but I think it's the right kind of tired." Evelyn nodded slowly. "You're building something now. That kind of work always makes you tired in a good way." That weekend, Daniel stopped by the center with Lily to drop off a new shipment of adaptive art supplies donated by the Bennett Foundation. He didn't stay long. He knew his role had changed too. Where once he had needed to intervene, now he simply provided support, the way strong roots hold the tree but do not dictate the direction of its growth. Before leaving, he and Nina shared a quiet moment in the main hallway. Daniel glanced through the window into the therapy room, where Lily was showing a younger child how to hold a crayon using a grip Nina had taught her months ago. "She's teaching now," he said, half in wonder. Nina watched, two eyes soft. "That's what healed people do. They pass it on." He nodded. Then after a pause, "You've become something rare. You know that. Not just a doctor. A bridge." Nina looked at him, expression clear. "Then I hope I lead somewhere good." He smiled. "You already do." In the final moments of the day, the sun began dipping behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the entry hallway of the center. A group of new parents stood nervously just outside the therapy room, holding clipboards, their expressions a mix of worry and weary hope. Nina opened the door to greet them, her presence calm but commanding. She wore her white coat again, this time with a new patch sewn beneath her name, Director, Pediatric Recovery. As she welcomed them inside, Lily stepped forward and took one parent's hand. "It's scary at first," she said, "but it gets better. Dr. Nina helped me find the parts of me I thought I lost." Nina didn't need to say anything. She just stood quietly, letting the space speak. Healing didn't always begin with treatment. Sometimes it began when someone saw you, stayed with you, and helped you imagine more. That's what Nina had become. A presence, a path, a reminder that even lives interrupted could find rhythm again. And that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin not with a grand gesture, but with a small, steady promise to keep showing up. One person, one session, one step at a time.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.